Thank you. So how are you all doing? Yeah, quite a morning. I'm Sue Donaldson. I'm a climate activist and a volunteer with 350 Massachusetts. And I'm going to be talking today about climate justice. And I should start by saying that I am probably the last person who should be talking about climate justice. So let me start with my confession. I am white. I was born in the lap of privilege. I went to Harvard. I'm an MD, so I'm a member of the elite. And everything that I always was told would be one of my best credentials is a disqualification for standing here right now. So bear with me. I'll do the best I can. I became a climate activist 3 years ago and was all over climate action and carbon dioxide and passing bills and like that. Not long ago, I started hearing more and more about climate justice. And it was not clear to me entirely what that was, but I have been learning about it, and I'm going to try and share some of that learning with you. Normally, this talk would start out with you folks perhaps having some questions and me hopefully having some answers. But for a change of pace, I thought I would start by asking you all for some answers. So if you would, for starters, first, how many people here know nothing about climate justice? Great, because there are a couple of people with no preconceptions. That's good. All right, so for the rest of you, if you would, take your index card and complete the following sentence. Okay, I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. When you're done, take your card and trade it with somebody next to you and just take a look at what they wrote. So would anybody like to read something that they either wrote or read? Oh, a bunch of shy people.
Mine is really long. Climate justice is not citing energy assets and other infrastructure automatically in poor communities and ensuring that developing countries do not bear disproportionate amount of costs/burdens of climate effects caused by development.
All right, did everybody hear that? No. Climate justice is not citing energy assets or infrastructures automatically in poor communities and ensuring that developing countries do not, sorry, my eyes aren't very good, bear differentiated amounts of climate burdens of climate effects on developing countries. Is that right? More or less? Okay. All right. Great. Anybody else? Can you speak louder?
The equal availability of environmental amenities such as clean water and clean air.
The equal availability of environmental amenities such as water and clean air. Is that right?
And, non-urban, you can go on.
Okay. Great. One more.
Climate justice is addressing the imbalance in effects of climate change on varying populations.
Climate justice is addressing the varying effects of climate change on different populations. Okay, those are all great. I got to tell you, there are many, many definitions of climate justice. And I thought I would just run through some of them that have actually made it into print, which I think any of these could. This is a pretty simple and somewhat limited definition, but it fundamentally acknowledges the injustice that is embedded in climate change. which is that fossil fuels and the civilization that they have enabled has unequally benefited the richest countries while disproportionately impacting poor people and developing countries around the world. So those who have done the most to cause climate change suffer the least from its consequences, and those who have done the least to cause it suffer the most. And this incidentally comes from the Ben & Jerry website, which I have found to be a source of much wisdom. A second definition takes the next step. Climate justice is a vision to dissolve and alleviate the unequal burdens created by climate change. That is, we not just acknowledge them, we got to do something about this inequality. Here's a broader viewpoint. Climate justice is working at the intersections of environmental degradation and the racial, social, and economic inequities it perpetuates. So this somehow makes climate action connect to a variety of justice fights, specifically mentioning racism, economic injustice. It's not very specific, but it brings in a sense that climate justice involves more than just strictly climate-related issues. Here's a more radical definition. Climate justice is the understanding that we will not be able to stop climate change if we don't change the neoliberal corporate-based economy, which stops us from achieving sustainable societies. The heart of climate justice is the understanding that the urgent action needed to prevent climate change must be based on community-led solutions and the well-being of local communities, indigenous people, and the global poor, as well as biodiversity and intact ecosystems. Wow. So this says to solve climate change, we have to change the economic system and also base our climate actions on community-led solutions. This means the justice piece of climate justice is not just an optional add-on. Let's solve climate change and see if we can do something about other problems at the same time. It's an intrinsic and necessary part of solving the climate crisis, is tackling these other issues. So this is my favorite definition from, of course, Wikipedia. Climate justice is a term used for framing global warming as an ethical and political issue. It's a way of looking at climate change. So let's talk about frames and how we frame something matters. There are a lot of different frames for climate change. I'll go through a couple. One is the science frame. This says the problem is carbon dioxide and methane. The solution, technology, clean energy. You know, we find a clean energy source, we're done. It's one viewpoint. There's the economic viewpoint. It's like this is a market problem. The market incentives are in the wrong direction. We got to have a carbon tax. We got to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. We got to create incentives for renewables. If we can do that, everything else will settle down. There's a political point of view, or frame. We have the solutions. We need the political will to implement them. Solutions to that: elect the right people, not always easy. Pressure the leaders that we have to do the right things. That's how we're going to get through this. There's the radical economic critique. Capitalism is the problem. We've got to overthrow the capitalist system, replace it with something else, and that will pull the rug out from under climate change. There's even a psychological frame which says the issue is climate change hits our brains in ways that make us dysfunctional. It's either so overwhelming that we go into denial, or it is such a sort of slow-moving and seemingly distant phenomenon that our primitive brains can't grasp that we have to do something about it because it's not right in front of us. And some people feel that if we could get the messaging right and just get past those psychological blocks, everybody would wake up and say, whoa, let's do this. And then finally, there's the climate justice frame, which we've looked at several definitions of, but basically which says that oppression, racism, inequality, all of those isms, all underlie climate change, and that the solution is that these oppressed groups must lead, and that social justice is intrinsic and necessary to solve climate change. So hopefully we don't have to pick only one of those frames and we can sort of move back and forth. But it makes a big difference which one you're thinking about at any particular moment. If you choose the political frame, for instance, that defines your constituency, your tactics, your worldview. In a political frame, your constituency is largely white, privileged people, conservationists, the liberal elite. Your tactics are that you form national organizations like the Sierra Club, you try to influence national policy, you create national parks and conserve them. Basically, you work together with and you try to influence those who hold power, whether it be political leaders or corporations. And your worldview is that climate change is one issue among many. There's climate change to think about, there's the economy to think about, there's racism to think about, there's the trade balance to think about, and you just have to get your policies right and solve it. If you choose the climate justice frame, you have a lot of differences. Your constituency, the people who understand what you're talking about and are listening to you and going to work with you, are the marginalized people, indigenous peoples, economically disadvantaged peoples, people of color. Your tactics are much more local: actions, rallies, civil disobedience, and alliances among social justice groups. And your worldview is that environmental problems and climate change are intrinsically tied to racism and inequality and oppression, and that you have to solve, or at least address, all of these if you're going to solve any of them. And to do that, you have to build from the bottom up. So let's look a little bit more closely at the climate justice frame. These are some of the premises that are held by many climate justice organizations. The first is one that we've already mentioned, which is that those who have done the least to cause the problem of climate change will suffer the most. The second is the concept of an ecological debt that is owed by developed nations and corporations to developing nations as a result of our appropriation of the planet's capacity to absorb greenhouse gases. We were greedy and we ate their lunch. A third is that frontline communities, as Maria Latona mentioned, the indigenous peoples leading the No Dakota pipeline fight, those communities are best equipped with the knowledge and skills to solve the problem, but they are generally left out of the discussions of how to do so. And so climate justice frame tells us that their expertise and input are necessary and that they should lead this fight. And finally, climate justice says that we can't solve climate change unless we address these other problems. It's not a single issue, it is part of a complex web of problems. So now if you would turn over your index card, because we have to save trees, and try this question. What one non-climate social issue would you most want to address as part of solving climate change, and why? Take a look at what they wrote. Does anybody want to read an answer?
I said access to adequate supplies of water for all people in the world.
Access to adequate supplies of water for all people in the world. All right. Yes?
Everybody.
And I say militarism because it costs much, and
militarism because it costs so much money that we need, and it pollutes the world. The most. Correct. One more. Yeah.
Poverty, because if you're poor, it's difficult, and for most people that's impossible. Think beyond food and shelter.
Poverty, because if you're poor, you can't think beyond your next meal, and it's hard to accomplish much else. Excellent answers. So this is a short list of issues that have been linked to climate change. I'm curious if anybody came up with something that isn't on this list? Yeah.
Mine was immigration, because we're going to have to be able to open our borders and our hearts to people as we deal with this problem.
Absolutely. Excellent. Oh, that was yours. All right. Yeah.
My thought was overpopulation, because
Oh, thank you. Oh, I am so embarrassed that that's not on my list. Thank you. That is overpopulation. That is critical. One more. Rule by the oligarchy of a few because that preserves the status quo. This is amazing because it's fairly clear that we cannot really solve the climate change crisis without addressing all of those and more. Okay, so we're starting to understand the linkage between climate change and all these other issues. Let's think a little more strategically. Take your other index card and write down one good reason to adopt the climate justice frame. And again, not exclusively. We don't have to ditch the science frame or the political frame. But what is a reason that it is strategic to adopt this frame in thinking about climate change? Yeah. Way more people are potentially involved. Absolutely. Yeah, and back. Oh, I missed that. Anybody else?
It can help us understand the intersection of all the necessary social, political, economic problems that must be part of the solution.
So it can help us understand the intersection of all these different problems. Indeed. Amen. Amen. All right. One more? Yeah.
It frames it as a moral issue.
Thank you.
From the heart.
All right. It frames it as a moral issue and from the heart. Very much so. All right, so I put together again, a short and no doubt incomplete list of reasons that I think this is a good frame to at least think about. No, we'll just go through them one at a time. One is, in fact, the moral imperative. I think this speaks for itself. There is terrible injustice embedded in the facts of climate change, in its cause and its effects, and in the divisions that it highlights between rich and poor, developed and developing nations, white people and people of color. That in and of itself is a reason to adopt this frame, and is also a compelling argument that I think can bring many, many people into the fight against climate change who may not be interested in carbon dioxide, but may respond to the understanding that, that there is this unjust effect of climate change. Then there's a question of efficacy. Does adopting this framework help us get further? Is it more effective to take the community-led, local, bottom-up approach than the top-down approach? How many people think it is, that it works better? How many people aren't sure it does? I love disagreements. So I've done some cherry picking of facts, I will admit to that. But just looking quickly at the history of the sort of political, national, international approach to climate change. The First World Climate Congress was in 1979. That's almost, well, 40 years ago. In 1988, James Hansen testified to Congress, basically told them an asteroid was about to hit the Earth. 10 years after that, the Kyoto Protocol was put together. The US did not join in. The following year, Exxon started making plans to undermine belief in climate science. And 2 years after that was the UN Conference on Climate at The Hague, and those talks basically collapsed. They were unable to come to any useful agreement. In 2001, Bush basically took the Kyoto Protocol off the table, said we would not even consider ratifying it. In 2009, not only did the US Senate kill Obama's cap and trade bill, but the conference in Copenhagen, that's already been mentioned, really fell apart and failed to come to any substantive agreement. In 2015, 6 years later, we do have the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement is voluntary and its targets are really insufficient to protect us against disastrous global warming. And in 2016, a climate denier, he who must not be named, is elected president. So it's hard to feel as though we have made substantial progress with this top-down national, international policy approach. Other countries have done better, but overall, it's hard to feel that we're winning. On the other hand, many more local fights have a happier outcome. And again, I will admit to some cherry picking. But there are many examples of fossil fuel and other polluting projects being defeated by local communities, which have often consisted of indigenous peoples, economically disadvantaged folks, or people of color. A couple of examples here, the Navajo and Hopi youth who blocked a coal mine permit for Peabody Energy, the world's biggest coal company. A workers' union in Texas that diverted $20 billion from nuclear energy into renewables. Bunch of power plants that were planned under the Bush energy plan, canceled, abandoned, stalled. And as was already mentioned, the current amazing fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline that is going on as we speak. So does this mean that we should fight the entire climate fight at the local community-led level? Well, probably not. I think we have to try all of the above. But it does mean that we have to learn from what has been done in these local fights. We have to honor their victories. We have to learn from their tactics and figure out how to tap into the passion of those local communities that have been so successful. A third reason to adopt the climate justice frame is that injustice has often been the cause of scuttling of international climate agreements. The injustice between developed and developing nations has been a primary source of failure at many of the UN climate conferences. The developing nations say, well, we're not responsible for this. We have incredible poverty. We need to move forward with developing our country, and we should get to use fossil fuels because we need them now, and you use them when you need them, which is hard to argue. I mean, in India, they have a lot of people who could use electricity, and they have a lot of coal. Developed nations are unwilling to give up their privileged lifestyles, I should say ours, privileged lifestyles, and don't want to allow developing nations to use fossil fuels because they think it's going to create more climate change, which it is. But that clash has really been probably the major rock on which the ship of climate change agreements has foundered. So if we don't understand that and we don't think through how to deal with that, the international agreements are going nowhere. Somebody mentioned the power of alliances. The more people we have working with us, the more power we have. This is, of course, the New York City Climate March, which demonstrated the incredible power of bringing diverse groups together. And this is just a sampling of some of those groups, which I'm just putting up here because it is mind-blowing. We have the African Youth Panel and the Municipal Art Society of New York. We have Concern for Helping Animals in Israel and Women in Islam. We have the Raging Grannies of Greater Westerly, Rhode Island, and the Communist Party of the United States. So if you can get all these people under one banner, you got power. And that's what we've got to do. There's another way to think about this, which is that not only can we probably not solve one problem at a time, but we can tackle more than one problem with a single strategy. These are just some things that the organization ACE in Boston has been doing that are really extremely strategic. They're working to make mass transit more affordable and accessible to youth and communities of color, which provides low-carbon transportation that is affordable and accessible, helps people get jobs. Perfect. They are creating community gardens that provide local organic food to communities of color. So you have low-carbon food because it's not being transported long distances. You have food self-sufficiency, which is going to become increasingly important, and you're serving people who are living in food deserts. They have a program for weatherization jobs that both employ and serve low-income communities of color. So you have less energy use, energy efficiency, good jobs, lower energy bills. It's a trifecta. Alternatives for the community and environment. Thank you. I had a blank moment. Here's another argument for using the climate justice frame, and this comes from Naomi Klein, who is, as usual, ahead of the curve on this one. She argues that racism specifically underlies much of the world's inaction around climate change. She asks, where would we be now if the victims of Katrina had been wealthy white people instead of poor black people? If England were going to be flooded out of existence instead of Bangladesh? If white people in Kansas were dying of starvation instead of black people in sub-Saharan Africa? I'm just going to read this because it's so eloquent. The reality of an economic order built on white supremacy is the whispered subtext of our entire response to the climate crisis. Thinly veiled notions of racial superiority have informed every aspect of the non-response to climate change so far. Racism is what has made it possible to systematically look away from the climate threat for more than 2 decades. Like, wow. Finally, if we think into the future, despite our best efforts, climate change is happening. It's going to continue to happen, it's going to get worse, and it's going to result in changes to our society, our communities, our food supply, our political system. We really don't know what it's going to create. But the notion of resilient communities is becoming increasingly important. If your food stops arriving at the supermarket, what are you going to do? If your national power grid can't keep up, what are you going to do? And so people are working on definitions of what it means for a community to be resilient and be able to bounce back from weather catastrophes, other system failures. And these are the things that people come up with. You have to have a well-functioning decision-making process in the community. You have to have local resources for food, water, energy, a strong infrastructure, housing, transport, and economic opportunities that include a diverse range of employment, income, financial services, All these things are necessary if a community is going to survive the challenges that climate change will bring. Do we think that communities that tolerate racism, poverty, sexism, oppression are going to be resilient communities? I personally do not think so. So, for the next 20 minutes, I want us to think about how using the climate justice frame and understanding climate justice should change our actions. And what I'd like to do is to have you all split up into groups of maybe 5 or 6 people, just geographically, write down your answers, pass them around, and talk about what you can do in your action group, in your community, in your friendship network, in your political behavior, that would bring the frame of climate justice into our work. You can take your chairs with you. There some feedback from at least some of the groups. Perhaps the person wearing the most color red in each group could report back. All right, let's get some local community-led ideas going here.
Okay, my name is Donna, and I live in Weymouth, and our group talked about 2 of us have not done anything, and then other people have done some projects with transportation and PSR, and so I am a part of FRAX, which is, there's a pipeline going in with a compressor station in Weymouth, and I'm a retired nurse. I've come to personally get my house insulated, put up the solar panels, and you know, act in that sense. I have my own garden, whatever, grow up my own food, compost, and then as a city and a locality, we are fighting this compressor station and frack gas pipelines, 5 miles of frack gas pipelines. This has taken us into, you know, hearings and protesting and going to meetings and standing out and everything else as far as actions, what I do on my level. Recently, I'm part of the Massachusetts Nurses Association, and just a week ago, Thursday, we passed a policy that hopefully against oil and gas infrastructure, that it should have a comprehensive impact assessment done, because a lot of these new pipeline proposals that are coming in do not have that. They have what's called an environmental impact assessment, which is just basically there are no tree frogs that are going to be hurt by this, but human beings don't get that level of evaluation.
Okay,
so that's what
that's great.
We've been doing, and I've been doing. So
awesome. Want to pass it along to another group?
Hi, I'm Jason, and one of the things that our group talked about was looking beyond.
If you hold the microphone closer to you, yeah.
Okay. You got it. We talked about looking beyond just climate-specific groups to other groups that, as we talked about, are related, and maybe being an ally to other groups, even if the words climate or the technological aspects or scientific aspects aren't in the mission statements. But, you know, like, so showing up for actions that are just not climate related in the way that we conventionally understand it, but actually are, as we've learned. And, you know, for example, and we also talked a little bit about sort of rebranding, or to use a less like corporate term, just changing the language of how we talk about it to incorporate the full picture that we talked about here. So for example, someone in the group came up with this idea of, if you have a neighborhood committee and it's the community resilience project or community resilience committee, all of a sudden it seems to, in my mind, appeal to so many more people who are concerned with survival, and prosperity more than just, the climate.
Oh, I love that.
Those are some of the ideas.
That's great. Next group, anybody?
Good for Red.
So one of the things we talked about is the people in groups most affected is changing, since wealthier people are being affected some now on coastlines and losing houses and things and wildfires, and wondering how much difference that is going to make in terms of being aware of climate danger and justice. We talked some about how the recent action in Standing with Standing Rock, when there was going to be a demonstration in Concord at the Army Corps of Engineers, and that was changed so that people could participate in the Native American-led action at Dartmouth, at UMass Dartmouth, and some of us had gone to that, and the impact of doing that, how important that felt to follow that lead, to be in that space and hear the approaches that the folks who led that had, and how that was a slower process. And we like to charge ahead and get very active and do things, but that it was very valuable, and maybe sometimes we need to take those kinds of actions. And then our conversation around Cambridge led, I think, to realizing there's not as much specific climate injustice there, 2 or 3 of us live in Cambridge, as there is, we come up against housing injustice as Cambridge gentrifies so much more.
That's great, thank you. Thank you for underlining that working together with other groups may sometimes slow us down or make things seem more difficult, but in the long run, it's the best strategy.
We had one question. Someone was considering solar panels in the Back Bay area and feeling like, well, wait a minute, but that's just apropos of the climate justice question. Is that just privileged people? Is that really, are we really doing something? So that's one thing we talked about. And I'm involved in something called Healthy Soil Stewards. And we're considering how to help people change the turf, the grass that they're growing even in their own little town in their front yard, because in order to have some other plants there that allow soil sequestration, carbon sequestration, so that goes in the soil, which would reduce the global warming. So.
Great.
Within our group, we spoke upon the topic of changing with the educational.
Hold the microphone really close.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Oh. Okay. So within our group, we decided to speak about an educational reform, to change the educational system to make youth, especially within high school and college campuses, to really think personally about what's been going on within the environment, and to really bring in speakers to address, a personal attention, because it's difficult to really latch, the youth's perspective on these issues that go on within the world. And since schools are very scientific based, it doesn't really allow room for, critical thinking. And so I feel like if we introduced kids to really focus more on the justice impact of, environmental change and reform, then I think that it would help to, really boost this understanding of climate justice within the youth.
That's great. I love that idea.
Why don't we both do it? Okay. Hi, our group went at this in two different ways. One was very international, and that's why I'd like him to share this with me. One good idea was to really take a look at our own actions, and that means where you put your time, energy, and money. Some people here are activists. They're working with their town legislators to get solar in town, avoiding plastics, also going to the state house and working for like carbon pricing. Others want to work on extending ties with other communities, like Mothers Out Front are very tight in two communities around here, but expanding that even further. Overcoming stigma is a talent of one of our people here, and there's many kinds of stigma. I mean, it could be racial, it could be a mental illness, it could be denying climate change, and use those strategies that he knows to facilitate the thinking, or hopefully the thinking can be changed if the money isn't underneath it all, and they really do believe in climate change, but they don't want to lose money. I pass this now.
And then additionally, I took up far more time than I should have around the equity side of considerations for a lot of organizations. Taking it one step further in terms of there are a lot of organizations that currently consider climate justice as their lens, but getting back to this idea of like we should be supporting equality, but even more than that, equity, because there is a systemic imbalance when it comes to the climate justice movement, and even from the consideration of big greens, and then also agreeing with supporting individuals that want to change their communities and providing them with the information to be able to do so and to support change within the next generation of students per se.
Thank you for that.
Working? Yeah. All right. So we talked about a majority, something that another group kind of talked about was the focus on the soil and expanding our definition of climate change to not only mean like CO2 emissions in the air, but what we can do in the soil to affect change and improve our own climate. And part of that discussion was what organizations exist globally, and then what exists in our local communities, and what people can do in conjunction with other groups besides just going to and using nice light bulbs rather than other light bulbs. And that was really well said. And take part of doing your own lawn or attending a party where you tear up asphalt that is going to be used to like be regrown, and how that's a way in where if you spread that message, or that there's something that you can do and that you can get involved with, that even the younger generations won't get perhaps paralyzed by fear that it is happening, and something that can actually happen.
Terrific.
So
Any
another
group that has not been heard from?
We had several ideas. One person talked about building community with an eye to sustainability and resilience and adaptation. One person is working with a program that encourages businesses to collaborate to do the right thing in terms of the common good, like to meet together and work out plans for how to operate in the community so that it benefits the common good. Another idea was paying attention to money and politics, specifically to permitting that goes on to favor corporations and builders and impinges on the rights of individuals and communities.
Thanks. So our group talked a little bit about, some of us had seen the film, maybe others also did at in the Kendall Square Cinema, The Age of Consequences. How many people saw that? Yeah, great film. Sophie Robinson, I think, formerly a colleague of Emily's, had a hand in that. Great film. Particularly because it did two things, and this relates to answering the question about how it might change our actions. The first one was that it was about national security and climate change. So suddenly there's a new set of allies possible, military folks, who are seeing climate change as a national security issue, a world security issue. And some who had worked in the Bush administration, for example, were coming forward and saying, this can't continue, climate denial aside, we have to address this. It's an important national security issue. So new allies, I guess, is the consequence there. The other one is that what Sophie and her collaborators did was have a systems approach. In other words, they had a kind of diagram that they lit up for each of the examples that they gave that showed the interconnection among all the issues that led to a particular consequence around climate change. So for example, in Syria, there were 4 or 5 years where there was serious drought and farmers were not able to earn a living. Young people, particularly young men, migrated to the city. Waves of immigration that provided recruiting material for ISIS, and as well as people migrating into Europe from there. So that's just one of the examples. So I guess the other implication for how should understanding climate justice change our action is that we might start to see issues that come up that formerly we'd say, oh, that has nothing to do with climate change, but in fact it does.